Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of such novels as Touch Your Nose and Jacoby Street, and founder of Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Thank you once again for joining us on the Write Project podcast. This is a very special episode. I know I say that they are all very special episodes, but this one really is. All the other episodes are trash. We're on with Michelle Porter, who is a poet currently living in St. John's, Newfoundland, who has been nominated for a Newfoundland and Labrador Book Award for her recent book of poetry, Inquiries, from Breakwater Books, hot on the heels of her last book, Approaching Fire, also from Breakwater. She's a wonderful poet from here in the province and just a great advocate for the community and for poetry and writing in general. Thank you so much for coming on, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. When I heard that Inquiries was short, or both long listed and then short listed, but when I saw the long list, it came slightly as a surprise because Inquiries, the years for the book, the awards take in a couple of years, and I had forgotten that, so I did not know that my book, which this one was published in 20. Let me just double check, so I got that right. 2019, yes. So I didn't expect it. So it was a real pleasure to think that this book has continued to have that life, for the years since it's been published.
I've said this wrong, haven't I? Come to think of it. Approaching Fire, I implied that one was first, but I'm wrong. That one's actually more recent. So you've got two books of poetry with Breakwater, and it's the previous of the two that's been nominated, correct?
Yes, and Approaching Fire has poetry in it, but it's creative nonfiction primarily.
Oh, I see.
So it's a mixed genre, Approaching Fire. So it isn't likely to be, it's such a mix and so much nonfiction that the poetry in it wouldn't qualify it, I think, for poetry. For a poetry recognition. It has made lists on nonfiction though. So.
But I'm like, why? Why not just put it into all categories? Here it goes into, it's children's too. Sure, why not? It's a little bit of everything. Go.
It's something that's happening in publishing, isn't it? Where we're breaking down, writers are breaking across genres and breaking down the boxes, and publishers are doing it as well, as they're beginning to think, where do these books fit on the shelves? Well, they fit on all the shelves if they're written in multiple genres. Yeah
and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that there's I see the benefits of genres, but like there's a part of me that's like, whatever happened to just picking up a book and you don't really know what it's about, and you just discover whether or not you like it or not,
And there's a freedom as a writer. I mean, it just depends what kind of person you are. Some people are strictly fiction, or they're strictly poetry, or they're strictly, nonfiction or historical nonfiction. So, everything happens in a linear fashion or an expected fashion. Some people like me, when we sit down to write, everything is, as I always say, everything is crooked, like the crooked fiddling style of, the Métis people. Everything comes out just a little bit unexpected, and and some of the music, the beauty happens in moving between genres. And in fact, this book of poetry that's up for nomination, Inquiries, it's purely poetry, but it has within it the ethic, or the sound. I call it talkie poetry. I call it it has that ethic of that journalism ethic, is that some of them happen in certain places at certain dates, and those are all clearly marked as, as might be in a journalism story, which is where I started out in writing. So even in this book of poetry that is, pure poetry, I have played with the sound and the way the words come together.
That's lovely. That's great. Awesome. All the best to you. It's up against some really cool stuff, but I hope it's wonderful. I got a chance to pick up Tom Dawes months ago before the pandemic in person.
Isn't he a wonderful poet?
He is. He is. It's very interesting work from him, and I hadn't. I'm shameful to say I hadn't read enough. Just despite being a poetry junkie, I had not read enough of him in the past. So like it was, even though it was a lot of new work and a lot of collected work. It was all new to me. You know what I mean?
Yes, very much. And his hearing him read his work, actually, he has such a way of invoking voice. I worked with him on his children's books of fairies. In what it published with Running the Goat Books, when I worked with Running the Goat Books, and to hear him, and that was very, very poetic. So it's very linked to his poetry. So it just, his way with words and his beautiful, deep approach was just inspiring when I worked with him on his book. And also, he talked about this book project that he was asked to do. They initially just asked him to, put together a collection of his poetry. He said, if I'm going to put together a collection, I want some new poetry too. And that's what he did. Thank goodness, because that's a beautiful book.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Tom's an interesting fellow when you meet him. I'm sure he'd be insulted by the comparison, or hopefully he wouldn't be. But he reminds me of talking to him. Reminds me of if you've ever before he died met Stan Lee. Everyone kind of said, like from Marvel Comics fame, people say that when you meet him, he would just kind of like put his hand on your shoulder and say something soft but kind of funny and just make you feel like you've known him for 30 years kind of thing. And that's the kind of affect that Tom has, you know?
Oh yeah, I felt that way. And I wanted to just sit and listen to him tell stories.
Yep. Wonderful, wonderful. So what do you think of the work of your the two other shortlister? There's Tom Dawe and there is Douglas Walburn Golf, I believe.
Yes. Now, Douglas's work is both Tom Dawes and Douglas's work, they're both steeped so much in Newfoundland and Labrador, but in very, very different experiences. So, you have almost a classical approach with Tom Dawe, which I love, and that magical approach. And then you have the Douglas's, which really is interrogating relationship, relationship with place through colonial intervention, through colonial traumas, colonial disconnection, and how to move forward with that in rebuilding, remaking. How do we remake relationships with place? And those are questions that all Indigenous writers are grappling with in very, very different ways. And Douglas is just a beautiful, stunning example. And I feel so honored to have my book listed alongside these two very, very different and very, very fine, poets and people with, actually a really, really deep relationship to Newfoundland and Labrador that comes through in their poetry, and my relationship with Newfoundland and Labrador comes through my poetry as well. But it's certainly much more recent than either of their relationship. And it's, within that ethic, I would say, moving on, moving along. So there's so much movement in my poetry that Newfoundland is a place that's moved to and maybe moved from, almost in a sense. Whereas with them, it is like sitting down and getting to know somebody. In their books, you're sitting down with them and the place and the stuff that they know, and it's beautiful.
Excellent. Lovely. That's amazing. I can't wait to see who the winner is, but everyone's winners in this. The readers are the real winners from this poetry NLBA, because it's lovely.
Wonderful. It's true. It's wonderful to have these awards just to bring a little bit more attention to what's happening in the poetry community, because especially especially in some of the upswing, this wave of beautiful Indigenous writing, we're getting poetry that engages with place, with Canada, this place we call Canada, in so many different ways. So, and these awards, they're part of saying to readers, hey, here's something that talks about, this place you think you know in a different way.
Excellent. Excellent. I love it. If it's okay with you, I'd love to. I've got a list of very annoying questions here that I'd like to ask you, if that's all right with you, and we can get to know Michelle Porter in a very strange Right Project podcast kind of way.
I'm up for it.
Okay, we'll see if that's true later. Michelle Porter, in your opinion, what are common traps or pitfalls that aspiring writers or poets can find themselves in?
Aspiring, I'm going to focus on poetry here. I think one of the beautiful things about poetry is how it can use metaphor to say more than one thing at once. So some poets early poets can approach poetry as simply an expression of experience, and it's beautiful that way. But as you're moving along the journey, you begin to link your personal experience with the universal. And of course, that's true of all writing. All writing is good when you link your personal experience, emotions that whatever brought you to writing, and link it to the universal. But it can take a while for, I think, particularly early poets to get to that place. And I'm going to say that the second thing that I'll say is almost the opposite, that is that poets forget to speak clearly in their poems sometimes, and try and make things sound too fancy, too complicated. Even when we're speaking universal, simple and direct are good, are wonderful. Readers really, really respond to that. And I guess the third thing I would say is that there are different conversations that are happening in the poetry world. So you have the conversation that the poet is, of course, having with themselves. You have the conversation that the poet is having with other poets. And sometimes that conversation a poet's having with other poets, they're doing that because, it's like when a sports person is talking sports lingo, and that's what's important to them. There's also the third conversation, which is the poet and their poetry and the reader. And that's where some of that magic happens, and that's where large audience stop and take notice of poetry. And I could think of so many beautiful poets who have come to that place where they're having these other conversations, but they're also having that direct conversation with their readers, and that's when we all come to poetry, and we all need it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is how I feel when I'm really into a poem. That's excellent. Yeah, that's awesome. Michelle Porter, if you could tell your younger poet self any one thing, what would that be?
Take myself seriously at a younger age.
Okay. Yeah.
I grew up in Alberta.
Okay.
Poetry can be, if you're not in the literary circles, and I wasn't. I was in one of 5 children of a single Métis mother. I was not in a literary circle, but I was a poet, and in Alberta, where poetry is suspicious in many ways, it's not. There's a broader conversation happening in Alberta that's oil industry, training for the job and whatnot. And I would just like to tell myself, what, these poetic conversations, the poems that you're writing, do have a place, and sort of it's sort of like keep at it, but also just these poems have value, and you will find your audience.
Excellent. That's amazing. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Poetry being suspicious. Elaborate on that. That's an interesting. What do you mean poetry is suspicious?
There is, in moving to Newfoundland, Labrador, which is one of the most beautiful things I've done for my writing career, without knowing that was the impact it was going to have. Here, there is broadly, I'm not saying there's not pockets, but broadly there is a love for, a respect for the storyteller, the poet, the person who's the poet through music, the person who's the storyteller through, whatever, through the piano, or there's really a love for the arts and a sense of interest in and respect for the artists. And for a child growing up, perhaps outside of the art circles that are there in Alberta, I would not ever want to say that I want to criticize the Alberta artists or the people who are doing amazing work there, but in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's almost everywhere. It's almost everywhere that somebody's a storyteller, somebody's a crafter, somebody's doing some form of art, and people understand why it's happening. In Alberta, in this, when I was growing up, I felt that it wasn't as well understood. And I felt it was I would feel defensive about it. And there wasn't a sense that there was a future in it or that it was a worthwhile endeavor. Again, that was particular perhaps to the way that I grew up in Alberta, and some of the messages I was receiving about, how to build a future for yourself. But as a poet, as a young poet, I didn't easily meet mentors. I didn't easily encounter a society of people, a group of people that would, embrace what I was doing and help me go to the next step. And, I suppose what I decided to do at that point, I studied journalism, which, changed the kind of writing that I do and perhaps even my approach, and has its own impact. It's lovely. But for me, that was a very practical decision.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I studied journalism. Well, it's really interesting that a lot of what you were saying there was really interesting. The viewing it as suspicious, that's resonates with me a lot, but also the mentoring and having the hardest part of the thing I get pushback from the most in my position, whatever that is convincing people that they have enough experience to be a mentor, be that poets like yourself or genre writers like me or lit fiction writers or whoever, convincing them, because I feel like writers have this thing where they look at not their accomplishments, but what they feel they have left to accomplish and go, well, I can't be a mentor because I have all this left to accomplish. And like everyone's a student when you're a writer,
And what's fascinating about that is I just finished my first mentorship, working as a mentor with a poet through the Writers Alliance Newfoundland Labrador. And it was an incredible experience, partly because of how much I learned from the experience. So I think writers who shy away from it, and I certainly would have and did for years in some ways, because you're right, as writers, we do see there's that gap between what we want to be and what we want to achieve and where we are right now, and and the path there. But we also forget how much we've learned, and how much we have to pass on to somebody who's just at that earliest stage. And as much as the young poet that I worked with, her collection of poetry, I think, as you know,
I was gonna say we can name them.
Oh, okay. Hannah, and working on her poetry, it became this beautiful conversation between herself today and her past self, but also with what's going on in the world in terms of the stories she was writing about. And for me, it allowed me, I became immersed in thinking about somebody else's poetry and somebody else's stories, and the broader curation and how things fit, and what do I want as a reader in this work, which isn't a way most writers listen to or pay attention to their own work. So the act of paying attention to other people's work so closely through a mentorship, you learn so much about yourself as a writer, which makes it absolutely invaluable for, for taking yourself to the next level as a writer.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, no, Hannah Jenkins, for anyone who listening doesn't know, after working with Michelle, she sent her book over to us, so that'll be in 2022. That'll be The Birds Come Out back in spring.
I look so forward to seeing that book, and I'm glad that you guys took it on to publish it.
I am too. I am shocked but very happy. Yes, that's much needed gap to be filled in our catalog, is getting more poetry out there and stuff like that.
And Hannah's book is an example of a poet who is on that journey of taking their personal stories and making them about broad things as well, about the universal. And she's done that beautifully in that book.
Yeah, big time. My board was all very. I've read it and I was like, oh yeah, okay, we need this, and then I handed it off to the board, and everyone was like, all right. Yeah, no, it's very.
We need her stories and her poetry. That is true. Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Michelle Porter, shifting gears, what's the best money that you ever spent as a writer? The best money you ever spent on your writing or on your career, anything like that?
Oh, let me see. The best money I've ever spent, let me see, probably a good chair so my back doesn't hurt and I can sit in it longer. I will actually say the office. I don't have an office right now, but when my kids are a little bit younger, a little bit more demanding, the best money I spent, it was what finished this book of poetry and Approaching Fire. I had an office. I rented an office for a little while, and it allowed me to get out of the house and to shut down the mother role and shut out, what does this child need? What does this child want? Do they need food? Do I need to clean the house? And I was gone, and I was able to just write.
That's excellent. Yeah, no, that does sound important. Absolutely. Excellent. Michelle Porter, what is the most unethical practice in the publishing industry right now that you're aware of?
The most unethical practice. That's a funny one, because I know that that's hilarious. I would like to say, I don't know. I would say that, what can I say about the publishers? I'm actually probably going to reach out and in the publishing world and sort of reach broadly into what is going on with ownership and building that's creating an ecosystem, a publishing ecosystem that doesn't allow for smaller independence, or that makes it more difficult. Makes it more difficult for them to breathe, makes it more difficult for them to get writers. And just in general, we all do well when there's a diversity of publishers and in the publishing industry. I may also just go that, being careful about the contracts. I have been lucky, but I know that I have heard stories about and seen the impact of contracts that, maybe lock a writer in where they didn't want to, or, doesn't in contracts that don't pay them, and writers who may just not know what a standard contract is, and somebody's sort of taking advantage of that in ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a blight on the industry, honestly, that happens. Michelle Porter, what did you do with the first money you ever made from your writing, be it from a contest or whatever, as long as the first check you got for writing something, what did you do with it?
Wasn't very much, and I think I just tucked it into the grocery bill money. With a couple of young kids, I think it was just nice to have a little bit more, a few nicer groceries or a few extra groceries in the house. It was a very small check.
Everyone who's a professional writer, that's what they end up saying. Like it's usually when it's like I've written one short story and they've gotten one thing. It's like, oh, splurge, Xbox. But when it's someone who's like, it's going to be their career, it's like, all right, well,
It was, well, yeah, and it's, you're if you're if you're writing, you've already made so many financial you've already made so many financial sacrifices that you get the check and it just goes in to plug a hole. Although I don't even think it was enough to go out for dinner if we were planning on doing that. It was just a tiny little check.
If there was a magic spell or something that turned your writingness, your writing self, your poet self, into an animal, what animal would that be?
A wolf.
Okay, why a wolf, if I may ask?
Because can I say two animals?
Yeah,
a wolf
yeah,
because and I'll say a wolf because some of the paths that I take in writing are feel like they're out in the wilds. A wolf is a family animal as much as it's a loner. And being, a mother and a writer, I move between those two worlds at the same time. Now, also, so albatross, specifically the albatross bird, because when I write and when I have stretches of time when I write, I feel like the albatross who is up, in the air and doesn't land for days. Their wings lock, they sleep up in the air. They do not land until they come down to, mate and have their chicks.
Is that true? I did not know that with the albatross.
And they have the longest wingspan. They're very awkward landers. And I would say that I'm an awkward lander in some ways. In my initial drafts of writing, my initial drafts land awkwardly. And, it's the process after that matters. But for me, writing is, this writing life is like that albatross bird that's out on the ocean and for days and days and weeks, months even. So.
I like that. Now I'm picturing some kind of like weird wolf albatross hybrid. I don't think there's a name for that in fantasy, but I think we could come up with one.
Definitely.
Yep. Excellent. Excellent. Another very strange question. This is a new one that I added because someone suggested it, an author, and then they bit their tongue when I absolutely said it, asked it, and then have asked everyone since, just to be horrible. But Michelle Porter, if you were a jam, what kind of jam would you be?
If I were a jam, oh my goodness, you know what? I love, and this would certainly be me. Maybe that's why I love these kinds. I love tart jams. They're slightly sour. Okay. Does that makes me sound like I'm cross, but not that. But it's something surprising. You take a jam and you put it on a piece of toast and you have, there was a jam, pomegranate jam. It's slightly sweet, but slightly sour, and it's surprising on your tongue.
That's amazing.
So maybe I do write poetry. I write the nonfiction, and I'm just breaking into fiction, and the stuff that I write is surprising. It's especially people get to know me because, or not when people first see me, I'm a mom, especially when you're a mom, and sometimes you're just a mom to people. And then they read something you write that is a little bit crooked, a little bit crazy, a little bit hilarious, or very serious. I have the range. And I feel like it's like that beautiful pomegranate tart, slightly sour taste that I love.
Okay. I love that answer. That's wonderful. That's probably the best thought out answer to that question we've gotten so far, I think. Yeah, that's wonderful. I might have to team up with one of the other people down that goes to the St. John's Farmers Market. There's a lovely vendor called the Jam Lady. When I'm done this episode, I might have to do some cross promotion and get her on to maybe for a week rename. So pomegranate jam will be a porter jam or something.
I love that. Yes.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.